Thank you very much. Now, first I should say I was picked up by a taxi at 3:30 a.m. this morning. Up to now, I'm still halfway coherent, and I hope I stay like this. And then, just a word of thanks. I think it's about 3 years ago when I was at Corpus Christi College and met an American visiting fellow called Paul Carey several times. And we quite often had chats together, but I would have never thought that I would at some point end up visiting him in Utah. And I'm very grateful for him to have initiated it, and also to Professor Peacock for not only arranging it, but also picking me up today. I feel that as someone who hasn't driven a car for 10 years, one is a bit lost in the Western United States. It's one of the differences between England and here. Now, I will try to kind of period around two different topics. Well, one is on the book of Daniel in medieval art. This was the topic of my master's dissertation in 2002 and has been always a bit of a hobby for me since this time. And I will explain how this research has been facilitated and also to a good deal shaped by the development of digital resources. I did not only use them heavily for my work, but in the last 2 years I had a great privilege and real fun to work at the Warburg Institute in London and actually to help to further develop one of these resources, and there may be a bit of self-advertising for that thing also. I will begin by stating the basic questions of my research, then speak more generally about databases in art history, and then address some problems you encounter when you look at the book of Daniel, both how you do research and also how you would make it accessible in this new medium. Now, first of all, what interests me is the transmission of biblical subject matter in images. Today, Bibles are virtually omnipresent. I forgot to check if there would be one in my hotel room here, but I'm quite sure there is. Probably a version that would be a bit unfamiliar in other places. But certainly this was not the case in the Middle Ages, when Bibles were not only really expensive, but also many people just could not read the text in Latin. Nevertheless, many of them were familiar with biblical subject matter, and what interests me is just these many different ways of the way these lots of different stories were disseminated. And working on these mechanisms also leads to quite a lot of more general questions. So about how the use of images, how our text and images are related, then to what extent is there change and to what extent is there tradition. And also, for which it's very hard to do, about how images were explained or understood or misunderstood. There's a lot more misunderstanding in this book which is coming out, but I'm afraid I haven't put any slides of that in now. Now, the method I decided to employ is rather straightforward. To try to study some biblical motifs as broadly as possible, from high art to primitive depictions, from the windows of Chartres Cathedral to some semi-barbaric early medieval amulets. And to try to have also look at a wide range of texts, also from scholarly commentaries to cheap edifying tracts. Now, if you do this, there's just tons of material. And so you only can do this for a very small part of the Bible. And the book of Daniel is a good example for that, for several reasons. The first is it is quite short. It's about 20 pages in the modern Bible. The second is it just was not that popular as, for instance, Genesis or the Psalms. I mean, you just couldn't do such a thing. And the third is that the book of Daniel is a real mix. You have some world history, you have some anecdotes, you have some prophecy, you have some visions, you have some hymnody. So pretty much all the genres of the Bible appear there. So it's really a very nice example for that. Now, this type of art historical research, which is primarily not primarily interested in the author of a work or in its place in its stylistic development, is called iconography. And iconographical research is actually a very traditional thing. And a lot of works done by, for instance, 16th and 17th century antiquarians looking at antique art would actually be called iconographic today. Nevertheless, iconography has always been a little bit in the back. And as a naturalist iconographer, you will never find a new Rembrandt or something like this. So it's just a little bit less spectacular and than some other fields of art history. And it's just a problem also with resources, because for an art historian it doesn't matter if something is a wonderful Raphael drawing which is reproduced hundreds of times, or some really obscure woodcut in an ugly book of which 2 copies survive, which no one ever bothered even photograph. On the other hand, the good side is you can do iconography with images, so you don't have to see originals. It's always nice if you do, but it's not necessary. And when art history started as a modern discipline in the 19th century, the only means of comparing images were actually the scholar's memory, and some of these people had a phenomenal memory. When you could make sketches, if you were rich enough, you could commission sketches, or you could collect prints, but there were normally only prints after some famous Renaissance and Baroque paintings, so it was a rather limited spectrum. There was a real revolution in around 1900, when first affordable photographic prints and when slides came in. And then it was for the first time possible not only to give lectures with lots of images, but also to collect them. But nevertheless, what was photographed and available then was only a small part of what is around. To give you an example, there are some quite interesting late medieval world chronicles that also contain the Book of Daniel, about 10 to 15 manuscripts, which have altogether 250 miniatures. I'll show a few later. Of these 250 images, 0 were reproduced before 1900. Between 1900 and 1990, about 10 appeared in books. And you can say about 20 more in microfiche, but that was it. And furthermore, the few books that really heroically reproduced tons of images. And there were some, like for instance, some 25 large volumes that tried to give photos of all illustrations of all German books printed before 1500. You just have to browse through them, which is good fun, but nevertheless it takes quite a while. There were also some dedicated photographic collections, but most of them also keep images according to the place where they're kept or according to the artist. So again, if you look for a subject matter, you have to browse through hundreds of folders, which is nice, but not so nice if you have to pay your hotel room. There were also 2 dedicated iconographic collections that have very different approaches, and so I have to introduce them. The first is the so-called Princeton Index of Christian Art, which was founded in 1917 by Charles Rufus Maury. This is called Index, and it actually was an index. The idea was originally to have a list, and I think it was originally just on cards kept in a shoebox, which subject matter appears on which early Christian sarcophagus, and there's an image of it. It grew quite a lot of it, and when it had reached millions of typed cards, what you see here in the picture is just the 1/2 of their card catalog. It's just an amazing amount of material, everything with descriptions, bibliography, and in some drawers behind, also copy photos of the images, all on standardized formats, all very, very labeled. It's the kind of perfectly organized system. The other one is very different. This is the Warburg photo collection, which I haunted for the last 2 years, and I actually hope to work again there from next summer. There are some political problems, but I hope to return there. And the Warburg photo collection started off with just a collection of photos of the very influential, also somewhat eccentric and very rich art historian Ebbe Warburg, who lived in Hamburg in the early 20th century. And only after his collection came, a few years after his death, to London, but it wasn't confiscated as a Jewish institution in 1933. One of the refugees that came with it, Rudolf Wittkower, who later became a very famous professor at Columbia, pretty much put a lot of tables together, put all the photos there, a few, maybe some 20,000, and tried to sort them into categories so that it could be easily found. And the collection has now grown to about, we don't really know, 250,000 images or so. And it's still in the same system. That's again only half of a room. You have these big drawers, and if you open the drawer, you have a lot of folders, and in the folder you have a lot of photos. Some of the photos are beautiful historical prints by the Fratelli Alinari, and Warburg must have been one of the best customers. And we're now out of copyright. It's a good thing, so we can digitize them. We have some cuttings from auction catalogs, some holiday shots taken by members of staff, including some members of staff who did everything out of focus. But also quite a few of me. Maybe people say the same about my photos in a while. And so some are labeled very valid at back, some are not labeled at all, some are labeled illegibly. So you never know what you find there. And so this was and about, when you get an idea of it, Daniel is about that much in one drawer and about the same amount in another drawer. The great strength is mythology and astrology, and we've actually 4 drawers full of Hercules. Now, when I began my research on Daniel, my late lamented teacher, Karl August Wirth, instructed me to go to both the Index and the Warburg Institute. And so I traveled to Utrecht, where a copy of the Princeton Index is kept, and to London, and came back with loads of handwritten notes and piles of photographies. I worked in frantically for 7 months, and the result was a collection of 1,200 images from the Book of Daniel, which were then photocopied, that had labels, print out labels, cut out, glued under the photos, photocopied again, and when it was about 4 volumes, it was about such a brick. And when I then continued my research, I had to carry these 4 volumes around to have images for comparison. There were already iconographic image databases around. A few years beforehand, I watched with some fascination how over about 10 minutes' time, an image downloaded from the internet built up on the screen in the State Library in Munich. We didn't even have internet at home. But when I did my master's dissertation, either I didn't bother looking or I didn't find anything. I didn't use any digital material then. Now I have about 7,000 images in a rather nice database on the laptop. That's a database at the top right. And I would guess that of these 7,000, about a third are downloaded from the internet, and a tenth are digital photos I could take in libraries. And to go back to these German chronicles, I said 250 images, only about 10 published. I have now in my database about 100 images from the internet and some 50 digital photos. So I still don't have everything, but I have more than half now. And I would suggest that this second revolution of images in art history, that is the second after the introduction of affordable photography, has 3 main factors. The first is the digital photography. That not only means that it's much cheaper, you don't have to buy film, you don't have to develop it, you don't need to employ someone to store the negatives and label them and so on. But it also changed the attitude. It is now very common just to go to a library and photograph quite a lot of material for your research. There's still some evil institutions like a British Library that don't allow it. But most do now. So it's much easier to get access. The second point is that the internet means that iconographic databases can be accessed from everywhere in the world. The Warburg Institute photo collection gets every week about 10 people who come in the flash. But in the moment, there are about 300 using our databases. I think of about 200 follow the links I put into the English Wikipedia. You can say they are not all really serious scholars, but who cares? They want to see it. And according to what the software says, the average time on the site is a few minutes, so probably quite a few really enjoy looking through the things. And it's not only this greater demand, there's now also just a political belief that at some point every work of art and every page of every manuscript has to be digitized, and a lot of money goes into this direction. So in the moment, if you want to get a grant, don't try to do a proper catalog, but try to do something digitally. It's silly, but it's just the way it is in the moment. And I would guess that digitization of collections will still take at least another 10 years. So there are also quite a lot of job opportunities there. Now, the third point is that databases make it possible to sort image in more than one ways. I said beforehand, even with the images that were available in big collections or in databases before, or in photo collections or in some books beforehand, quite often you couldn't search them for iconography because they were organized in a different way. But now you can tag each image in as many ways as you want. And so some big photographic collections like Photo Marburg, which has a lot of German museum holdings, has now at least a partial iconographic search. It's not the best that there is, and it always crashes, but still, it's much better than nothing. And also in the Warburg, we can now put an image under 10 different headings, whereas if you have one photo, you can only put it under one drawer. And if you have a portrait with an allegory in the background, we always had to decide, and normally we thought the allegory was more fun, so we put it there. Now, there's also a bit of a change in the attitude to images. Historically, many collections were really jealous guardians, a bit like Fafner and Siegfried, of the images. And I remember years ago, I got a photo of a very precious manuscript in Trinity College, Cambridge. I didn't dare ask for a manuscript, but I wanted to see a detail. And so they gave me a photo, I looked at it, and then I took it away and shredded the printout, just so they couldn't take it away. Now, I discovered 4 weeks ago that the same manuscript is now online in much better quality. Now, still there are some differences. The old-fashioned systems, like it's the old British Library manuscripts database, just had their images, normally JPEGs, normally not that big and not that spectacular, and you could just click with the right button on the mouse if you had a PC and save it. Now, the Warburg still looks like it, so you can download quite a lot of rather good PDFs. The more recent systems work with some kind of viewer platforms, so this means you have this kind of viewer page where you can get a certain number of pixels. So you can get a bad image of a whole page, or you can zoom in and you can get some really spectacular. And I mean, this thing has never been photographed that well before. But on the other hand, you can't get the entire page in this quality. And in most cases, you can either do just a screenshot, which normally is bad quality and you can't enlarge it, or they have a download button, but it's normally rather bad quality. So there is now this approach of look at me, but don't take me away. I don't know, maybe this will pass and you will be able to download things again. Maybe the time of downloading will be over and it will be just like people don't want to possess music because they can listen to it on YouTube anyway. So maybe in the future, there won't be databases with images, but just with links. But for instance, I would say my computer isn't there, my database isn't there yet. And normally, most databases that allow download, as far as we make any statements about legal questions, put the images under a so-called Creative Commons license, which is a very practical thing, which is also used by Wikipedia. It means you can use the image, you can republish it on the internet, as long as A, you don't make money with it, and B, you say where it's from. So, and this is a rather good compromise, and so one is now quite often on the safe side with reusing these images. Now, a big problem with the images is if you want to search them, they have to be labeled. Most museums are quite good in labeling their objects. And when digitization of manuscripts started, they actually did quite well. So the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, which is one of the big manuscript collections, started a really nice, sophisticated database where you could look through the records through, for instance, I don't know, images of a nativity with St. Joseph holding a lantern. So you could do really nice keyword search. But they've now given it up, and now they just scan the pages and download it as a book, and you have to flip through them. Naturally, the advantage to the past is that you can do so from at home. But there's a lot, and I actually believe that institutions like Warburg should in the future not so much try to get new photos, but rather work together with other collections and make their thing kind of searchable. And quite often, for the first time, actually try to find out what the pages show, and I'm in the moment actually trying to start off such a collaboration. Now, how did this dramatic change with images influence my work? First of all, there's a lot more work now. You can't just have the excuse that there are only 5 images published and you couldn't expect me to travel around the world to see the other 50. And the other bit is, what has changed is that most of the images published in the past were rather good, were rather works by great artists. And extraordinary and very creative artists were quite often not only great in their style, but also invented new iconographies. And this meant that a lot of the iconographic works in the past worked a lot on rather unusual and eccentric types of images. And once I came across a dictionary article where each thing that was described was an exception and a one-off. And the 95% of the other images were not described. Now, we still are far away from having all medieval art online. I mean, the collections would still have to be digitized. It will still take years and years. But also, a lot of art is not in libraries or museums. And so in the moment, databases are very much in favor of prints, manuscripts, rare books, small goldsmith work, and such objects, whereas murals and stained glass are really a bit left behind. So what we have is very partial and skewed, but we can try to do a bit of statistic. And this is to a certain extent a bit disappointing. Like, to give an example, France was in the 13th century a center for production of Bibles. And virtually all of them that have a lot of images have, at the beginning of the book of Daniel, Daniel in a lion's den. So I found out at the end that I had 150 images Daniel in a lion's den from 13th century France. However, if you look at them, about 100 look like the ones I have now on the screen. So you have the lion's den is a cave in a hill. You have Daniel is young, with a halo, no beard, wearing a tunic, and in most cases also cloak, quite often in red and blue. And he has his hands at the heads of two lions. And it's quite interesting if you compare that with Bibles produced in other countries. Like, for instance, in England, there are far less, but there you find quite a much greater variety that you would find in France. And maybe some people think that always monotony is very medieval and the really creative genius of the Renaissance did things differently. Printing makes it far worse. This is a scene from Daniel chapter 7, Daniel's vision of the four beasts, which in the Middle Ages quite rare and normally quite fun. I'll show another example later. But it became a stock motif for illustrating Bibles. And I found, I think, 55 images, I think 51. 23 show the four beasts together in a row at the seaside, and 22 show them projected on a world map. And only 3 images have something different. Now, to a certain extent, you can say it's getting really boring and frustrating to do iconography. But the one thing is you can do, and this is my catalog on the New Testament illustrations on, it gets quite interesting with copying and workshop practices, and what do you take, what do you modernize, and so on. And you can really kind of get close to the artists, and to be quite often not only the artists, but also in this case the publishers and the printers. So it feels very much hands-on. And the other bit is you just realize how difficult it must have been to be really creative and really to do something new. Now, this was a bit more general thing about images, and now a bit about Daniel and problems with Daniel. One can roughly discern 2 ways of how biblical narrative could be used in the Middle Ages. Firstly, the biblical stories could be retold as stories in text and images. And secondly, a single event or just a quotation could be out of context and given a new significance. And I show some examples of both. Whereas we have already really splendid images from the book of Genesis from late antiquity, Daniel only really starts as a narrative in 9th, 10th century Spain, but it's a pretty dramatic start. So we have some manuscripts where there isn't just one little Daniel in a lion's den as in these later French Bibles, but one full-size image per page. And this is probably the most beautiful of all of them, the dream of the king Nabucodonosor. I always use the names used in the Middle Ages. In Protestant Bibles it would be Nebuchadnezzar of his big tree. Another Bible has a kind of comic strip at the beginning of each book. And it has, I think, 4 pages of comic strip for Daniel. I only show the first. So you have, first row, the king dreaming from a big statue. Then the next image, he asks his astrologers what it means. They have no clue. Next row, the king gets angry and has him beheaded. And then Daniel comes in and explains what the dream means. And the third image is already the 3rd chapter of Daniel. The king erects this great statue which everyone has to worship. And this is also images I've downloaded from the Bibliothèque Nationale. And you could get the details in far higher resolution. That's also one of his viewer websites. Now, this is another Bible which has a similar comic strip a few centuries later, but you can see the choice of scenes is quite different. It starts again with the king's dream, but then you have and the astrologers, But when you have Daniel saying, don't kill all the astrologers, I may find a solution, when you have this tiny image of Daniel's friends praying, then God handing down the interpretation of this nice scroll, and then Daniel telling the king what the dream means, and then at the end, the king falling down and worshipping Daniel. Now, how do you do such a thing in an iconographic database? If this page were cut out in a museum, they would probably just make a description, and you could search these descriptions with a kind of keyword search, which is always dangerous with Nebuchadnezzar because you have a risk getting a few thousand Babylonian cylinders. But if you try to do it halfway cleverly, it may work. The Princeton Index has a system of subject headings, a bit like the Library of Congress subject headings. And they would, for instance, be Nebuchadnezzar, Dream 1, Nebuchadnezzar, asking astrologers, Daniel, before Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel, God reveals him dream, and so on. Now this makes it, if you know the subject heading, it's very easy to find the images, and it's very quick and straightforward. But they are not in the order of a narrative. They have a secondary index for cross-references. So you can find things, but it really takes the story into a lot of different bits, and you lose a bit the connections. The Warburg has a hierarchical system, and the nice thing about doing it hierarchically is that you don't have any kind of logical overall structure. You can do it in every subcategory as it's just the most appropriate. So for instance, the section we have about saints is just saints A to Z, because that's just the easiest. With the Bible, we try to, at least with the Old Testament, we try to do it in order of the biblical narrative. So if you look at the database, which we have, which is free online, you would get religious iconography, when you could choose Old Testament, when you get all the biblical books, Daniel, Nabucodonosor's dream, and then loads of individual episodes in that. I have to say, if you try it, you will be a bit disappointed. We haven't put much Bible in it, and I created this just pretty much to make the screenshots to show you how we hopefully will structure it when we get there. But I hope you get a bit of the idea. And the nice thing about that is that the stories that are related are just kept quite closely together. At the Warburg, we claim that our system inspired a very famous iconographic system called Iconoclass, which was developed by a Dutch art historian called De Waal. It is basically hierarchical as ours, only a little bit more, let's say, logical, coherent, philosophical, explaining the world, whereas ours is really just to find images quickly. And De Waal introduced codes. So for instance, Bible is 7, Old Testament 7.1, Daniel is 7.1p, and God reveals the dream to Daniel would be 7.1p124. Now the great advantage of this system is that it's language neutral. And if you have to try to find obscure biblical figures in a Dutch database, you know that is really an advantage. If you want Dutch databases, first look at the Dutch Wikipedia, how a person is called. That's something I normally do that. The great disadvantage of it, that it's a bit like the Library of Congress system, it's really cast in stone, and once something a code is used, you can't change it. Whereas at the Warburg, if we would get a lot of new images and see that an older structure doesn't really work, we would just redo it. Because we are, to a certain extent, nominalists. We believe that what is there is the images, and we just build the structures around them. But this Iconoclass system is used naturally in the Netherlands and also increasingly in Germany. And maybe we should at some point have some kind of links to it, but we will still try to keep things flexible. This is, for instance, an image which is very rare, with 3 Hebrews praying that Daniel may get his revelation. This was, until a few weeks ago, the only copy I knew. I've now found a second one in a Russian monstrous manuscript from the 16th century, that has only been very recently published. But, so you couldn't put that on an Iconoclass, and probably it would be a lot of persuasion to create a new category for this, whereas we would just make a new one. Now, it sounds nice and straightforward, just put in the Bible in the order it's told. It doesn't work like this, unfortunately. Although the book of Daniel is used in the Middle Ages in the Latin Vulgate, It looks like kind of very nicely one book. Actually, some parts of it were written in Hebrew, some parts in Aramaic, and some parts in Greek. For theological rather than philological reasons, Martin Luther decided that the Greek parts of the Old Testament weren't really proper Bible, and so he pushed them into the background and called them the Apocrypha. And most Protestant Bibles still have them, and others, like the LDS Bible, omit them totally. But well, this doesn't mean that these scenes are not shown in Protestant art. They're quite popular, especially in the Netherlands. And one of the stories that belongs to this Greek part of Daniel is a second story of Daniel in the lion's den. Daniel chapter 6 says that the king was forced to throw Daniel in the lion's den and was very relieved to see him still alive the next morning and had him pulled out. Daniel chapter 14, which is only in the Greek Bible, says that actually Daniel was staying for a week in the lion's den, and since naturally the lions were not fed because we should eat Daniel, he grew rather hungry, and then God sent an angel who carried the prophet Habakkuk on his hair to the lion's den with some food. Why not just the angel brought the food, I don't know. And now quite a few people would say, if you have Daniel in the lion's den without Habakkuk, it's an illustration of Daniel chapter 6. If you have Habakkuk, it's Daniel chapter 14. I don't think that makes much sense, because maybe in some cases Habakkuk is missing because there isn't much space. And also if you have only Daniel and two lions, like on the left, which is very common in early Christian art, it's very majestic, symmetrical. Whereas if you include Habakkuk dangling on his hair and bringing normally some kind of pot with some hot food in it, it's always a bit more narrative and anecdotal. And some artists wanted the one, some wanted the other. And the question is also, did artists even know that there were two versions of a story, or did they just have an idea, oh yes, Daniel in the lion's den should look like this approximately? And there's indeed this one nice example that proves a bit the case. This is from a book that compares Old and New Testament, and it says the king who comes in the morning to the lion's den and rejoices that Daniel is still alive is like Mary Magdalene, who came in the morning to the tomb of Christ and found him alive. Now, this is clearly chapter 6, because only that says that the king came to the lion's den in the morning. However, a lot of artists added just the Habakkuk bringing the food, which is really silly, because Daniel needed the food a few days earlier. So it doesn't make much sense, but it just shows that many artists even thought, actually, Daniel needs this Habakkuk flying around, otherwise it's not a proper image of Daniel. And to make things worse, in some later copies of this book, it even says at the text, as you can read in Daniel chapter 14. So these two stories were really confused. This means if you put them into a database, it would be silly to divide them. And so if you've Daniel in the lion's den, you would put all of it together and then rather just divide it for pragmatic reasons into, is there Habakkuk or not, is the king looking in or not, how many lions are there, and so on. So one just has to be careful that there's quite often art and artistic tradition that is a bit separate from the Bible. It still illustrates the Bible, but it has a bit its own life, and artists quite often just depicted what we were familiar with. Another problem is which version of the Bible to use. In most cases, differences between Bible translations are rather stylistic, or if you want we and thee or you and such kind of things. But occasionally there are kind of real problems about what a certain passage means, and quite rarely they can influence art. I showed two examples. One, the first one is pretty straightforward. In this vision of the seven beasts, the second beast, a bear, has three things in its mouth, which are in the Aramaic original called il-in. This is a very rare Aramaic word which appears only once in the Bible, and it's quite hard to translate. Jerome, who worked over a lot of early Latin Bible translations and produced the so-called Vulgate, the common Bible translation, which is a standard in the Middle Ages, found this means ordines, orders. It's a bit hard to depict. Only one artist tried with the top left, where this poor bear is like a shark, 3 rows of teeth in his mouth. Other artists looked at Jerome's commentary on Daniel and says, because apparently Jerome said, that's really a bit unproblematic, I have to find an explanation for that. So he says the bear stands for the kingdom of the Persians, which swallowed 3 other kingdoms. So the 3 ordines mean these 3 kingdoms. And then quite a few images show this bear swallowing 3 small kings. There was a very odd Bible, which is great fun, and I did an article on it at some point, which was a translation from Hebrew into Spanish, done by a rabbi for a Christian patron who was curious in how the Jews read the Bible. And this rabbi even says in the margin, Jerome is wrong. This word means ribs and not orders. And I don't know if he also told the artist, you really have to show the ribs, or if the artist read the text. In this case, despite the rest of the images being quite traditional, the bear is chewing on these 3 really, really big ribs. On the other hand, Luther translated the word with teeth, but most illustrators of the Luther Bible still kept these 3 kings, so they apparently didn't read it. The second example is a bit more serious. It gets to a really difficult part of Daniel, chapter 9, with these very complicated prophecies. And there's one sentence which in these earlier pre-Jerome Latin translations was read as the anointing shall end. And there was an interpretation, this means when Christ is born, all the old Jewish priesthoods end. Now Jerome said, actually, it doesn't say anything about anointing, it's about the anointed, the Messiah. So it means it's a prophecy Christ will be killed. Unfortunately, the older version had been quoted by some theologians, and as happens quite often in scholarship, that you just pass on things quoted from someone else without checking if they're really an original book. This mistranslation was still alive and well in the late Middle Ages, and it's quite fun. These are 2 books that are both commentaries on the Creed, and both have this Daniel holding a phrase with a sentence. The one says, the anointing shall end for the birth of Christ at the left. The other, Christ shall be killed for the death of Christ at the right. And apparently no one checked that there's actually 2 translations of the same sentence. Now, we have the Bible, but not all biblical motifs come from the Bible. There was one very famous history book based on the Bible called the Historia Scholastica, made by a man called Petrus Comestor. It literally means Peter the Devourer. It didn't mean that he ate a lot, but he read so much. And this is basically, he took a Bible, left out all prophecies and poetry, so kept only the history, put that into chronological order and added some more historical bits. And this was very popular, especially in France, and most beautiful French images from Bibles actually come not from late medieval. French images from Bibles do not come from Bibles, but from this Comestor. Most of it is straightforward biblical motives, but he added 2 scenes, both rather bloodthirsty. The one illustrates the claim that Daniel and his companions were actually princes of Israel who had been castrated by King Nebuchadnezzar. And the other, which is way more popular, shows the story that Nebuchadnezzar's son, Evil-Merodach, was so scared of his father that he didn't dare to accede to the throne before he had made sure that the body of his father was cut into 300 bits and fed to 300 birds just to make sure that he couldn't recover. And I would say for the late medieval audience, this is just a part of the story of Daniel. And since this coward, or rather rude son, Evil-Merodach, was also regarded by some people as the inventor of chess. This image appears in chess books, so in Caxton's chess book, which is one of the first books printed in England. Another series of paraphrases is very different. They are the World Chronicles I've mentioned earlier, made by someone called Jans Enikel. It's, I think, over 100,000 absolutely excruciatingly bad verses of Middle High German. I hope there's no German scholar who disagrees with me. I just read through parts of it, and I found really bad verses. And they are not written for scholarly work, but for entertainment. And so you can say that Enikel improved the Bible. If you find the storyline a little bit odd, he just changed some persons around. And especially with Daniel, which is really, as each chapter is a bit like in a TV series, where each chapter starts pretty much at 0 again, and at the end the king is converted, and then he forgets everything. So he tried really to make that coherent. And he also added quite a lot of material from Arthurian novels. The Bible says in Daniel 4 only that Nebuchadnezzar or Nabucodonosor went mad and lived for 7 years with the wild animals until his hair and his nails had grown, and then he got his senses back. According to Enikel, Nebuchadnezzar did it like Yvain in this famous French verse novel. So he starts getting mad, stands up, strips off his clothes, runs in naked into the forest, starts climbing up trees, scares some people. And when he recovers, he does the thing which a proper Arthurian hero did after killing a few dragons. He goes back and has a bath. And these images were very popular, so you get quite a lot of that, and not only as illustrations to this text, but also the top one is a big ceiling, which is the entire world history in this kind of room, which belonged to a guild of weavers, very rich craftsmen in the city of Augsburg. And apparently for them, this was probably seen as a proper model for the world history. Now in a database, things get tricky. Where do you put them? And you probably would have to put them both under literature and also under Daniel, because there are still variants of a biblical story. So if you ever put in some of these images, we have to have a hard think. Now, only very briefly about the second bits of a Bible in different contexts. I only will describe two contexts. The first is the liturgy. Now, liturgy, the services of a church, which means for Middle Ages, chiefly the Catholic and the Byzantine churches, one has to say the Latin or Greek church, because some of the Greek churches were actually Catholic, but have these very rigid orders of service, and as part of that, pretty much the same parts of the Bible are always read at the same occasions, and this hasn't changed from the 9th to the 20th century. And it's always quite important to know which part are actually used in services, because firstly, they're in service books and so more often illustrated. Secondly, these were the bits that people heard quite often, and the clergy who commissioned a lot of works of art had to preach about. So they knew them just much. If you ask what should we depict there, they probably would think about something they had written a sermon recently, if they liked what they've written. And thirdly, it's always these combinations of having some parts of a Bible, some chants at a certain occasion, and it really changed the interpretation. And so you quite often get illustrations of the Hebrews in the fiery furnace, and occasionally also from all the texts around, like the right image. This is the one where the photo I got was shredded a few years ago, from a copy of the Utrecht Psalter, which shows all kind of creatures, rain, snow, rivers, seas, sea monsters, and so on, praising God. Here's a similar thing from a Greek Psalter, which takes it over several pages. And also this manuscript was only recently digitized by the British Library. Until then, there were only pretty horrible black and white photos and some rather low resolution color images on a CD-ROM around. And on some occasions in the year, there are longer parts of the same chapter read and recited, which are very rather earnest and very long services that normally culminate, well, if there's occasion if it would be a baptism or an ordination of priests. And these texts are getting interpreted in this way. So it's said that the new priests have to have a faith as strong as the three Hebrews in the furnace. Then there is a rule that no one should kneel for the prayer after this thing is sung, which has totally practical reasons, or rather historical reasons. But then it said this is a reenactment of the three Hebrews not worshipping the image. And then so they really interpret now the biblical text from its setting. And it's also something which one forgets often today, really, that for most people the Bible wasn't something they read at home because they didn't have a Bible, but something they heard proclaimed and heard sung. And so I showed just 2 minutes, if I get the thing to work, it's actually 2 minutes from an ordination service. So we have at the end you have at the start, the end of someone singing the narrative, and the Hebrews were in the furnace, and the fire didn't hurt them, and they praised God. And then, after a short break, the choir was a bit sleepy, they come in then with this text, "Blessed be God of our fathers." And I showed also music at the left-hand side in a more legible notation, and the right-hand side something I just found, now also digitized in the oldest record of this tune. Now, just the last point of putting bits from the Bible in different and the liturgy has quite often been a bit neglected by art historians. The Princeton Index mentions it a bit in the database, and I'd like to make some liturgical references in the Warburg database, but I still don't know how to do it, because you can't do it per category, because quite often things are also quoted outside this context, and you can't just impose it. Now, the very last example of biblical bits in context is typology. Typology comes from the Greek typos and means actually, has to do with making coins. So if you make coins, you have a piece of metal, and you have this hard die which you press on it, where the impression is left on the coin. And typology means in theology the concept that the Old Testament can be read as foreshadowing of a New Testament. The basis of it is quite straightforward. New Testament, Christ says, I'm here to fulfill the law. And Christ says, and he also says, like Jonah was in the belly of a sea monster, the Son of Man will be in the grave for 3 days and then resurrect. But with this thing in mind, people started searching for parallels. And if you're creative and you have a lot of spare time, you can find quite a lot of them. And it was really, especially in the high and late Middle Ages, a hobby to find typology. Many of them is pretty weird, and no one ever did these comparisons again, but a lot is really straightforward. And one of the first big typological programs was in Canterbury Cathedral, the oldest cathedral in England. Unfortunately, glass is fragile, and especially with people like Oliver Cromwell going around, quite a lot got damaged. And so there's only a bit of a typology left. But Daniel is still here, but he's at the bottom left of his image, but he lost his 2 lions. So you must imagine them. Now, Daniel and the lions then is here not a part of the story, but the type, so the Old Testament model for the antitype of Christ in the sepulchre, which is in the diamond in the middle. And there's some more types around it, like Joseph being lowered down into a pit at the bottom left, or Jonas being lowered down into the sea monster at the top right. And this window actually comes from a photographic campaign we recently did. I complained a bit that so much about databases now, about things in museums. And so I'm trying to persuade Warburg to do a campaign of photographing stained glass in French cathedrals. And as a kind of pilot, we sent our photographer for a day to Canterbury to see how much he could do with an equipment that wouldn't cause suspicion for looking too professional. And I think the result's actually quite nice. Now, I tried, when I put this into the database, really to trace all these typological links. See if at the top, first what it shows, Genesis, Joseph thrown into the cistern, and then life of Christ, Christ's body lowered into the sarcophagus. But also what it says, the types of prophecies from the Old Testament, Genesis, Joseph thrown into the cistern, type for the burial of Christ. So I tried to organize all these pairs, which is rather nice. And then you can also trace them down, like this, for instance, everything we have now in a database, which is used as a type for the entombment of Christ. And one can then also just see where these parallels were used, and that some of them were used for quite a while. I'm still a little bit weary about this system because it suggests that typology means A equals B, which is just silly. I mean, we weren't that naive. The typology means normally one aspect of A can be compared to one aspect of B. And there's a reason why you have normally in typology always some explanations in text around or in a manuscript. And it's always worth reading them. So the database is only simplifying, but I think it's still worth it to do it. And I think I'll leave it here now, speaking a bit over time anyway. Just what I wanted to show you is how much is out there that waits to be discovered, and how much also technology can help us to do. So, thank you.